a pleasure to be here this fine day. And I think despite the challenges that is occurring globally, despite the distance, we can still have a conversation and discuss something that is very, very pertinent and very informative for our listeners and viewers. And hopefully this will be a productive session for all of us. As we know, according to the National Health and Mobility Survey that was recently conducted, as you aptly said, the risk for diabetes, hypertension, and hypercholesterolemia currently in Malaysia is reaching epidemic proportions, probably even more than the COVID problem. But as you know, this is a chronic disease, so the impetus as well as the awareness about it is not as great as something that is a very acute and a very widely spreading disease like COVID. Having said that, yes, we do have guidelines in place, both in the local setting as well as internationally available for most of the physicians as well as private practitioners as well as general practitioners in Malaysia to adhere to. And currently, we have in our Academy of Medicine website a host of clinical practice guidelines that is available for medical practitioners. So I will just list a few that practitioners can use to actually adhere to start off a protocol towards these non-communicable diseases. The first being is the Ministry of Health's 5th edition Clinical Practice Guidelines for the Management of Dyslipidemia, which was published in 2017, and this is the 5th edition. Another guideline is, of course, the Clinical Practice Guideline for the Management of Hypertension, which was in 2018. We also have the Clinical Practice Guidelines for the Primary and Secondary Prevention of Cardiovascular Diseases, which was published in 2017. So most of these guidelines are quite recent actually. And unfortunately, our diabetes mellitus type 2 diabetes CPG guidelines was actually published in 2015 and it's due for review. So that's the only one that is probably out of the sync of the last few guidelines that we have. And currently actually we are into our National Strategic Plan for Non-Communicable Diseases. This is a strategic plan that the Ministry of Health is embarking at the moment. And the program has been set in place for 2016 till 2025. And this is a product from the Department of Public Health. And that is another guideline that practitioners can actually adhere to. Similarly, there's another action plan for the Nutrition of Malaysia, the 3rd edition, also from 2016 to 2025. This is another paper that our viewers or listeners can actually use, practitioners as well in Malaysia. Internationally, I will just mention two that probably is quite recent. One is the 2020 International Society of Hypertension Global Hypertension Practice Guidelines, which was just launched. And of course, the International Diabetic Federation, IDF, Diabetic Clinical Practice Guidelines, which was published in 2017, recommending the management of type 2 diabetes in the primary. Actually, that's very true. The public awareness on the magnitude of the problem is still a very important component in facing the problem. And according to the our NSP, which is the National Strategic Plan for Non-Communicable Disease that I mentioned from 2016 to 2025, there is already a plan in place, which we call as NESPAL, which is the National Strategic Plan for Active Living. And this is expected to intensify and continue. This is a structured program of non-communicable disease prevention and control program for activities in Malaysia. So in short, NASPAL provides a more holistic approach in the physical activity promoting programs and activities, given that NASPAL outlines strategies not only for the government, but also for the health sectors in collaboration with all the non-governmental organizations as well as the non-health sectors as well. The public health concept, particularly for the work by WHO, has been adopted and utilized in the formulation of our organization, which is called NASPAL. And the 6 thrusts that NASPAL has for the creation of a healthy and active community is one, in the strengthening of public policies that support active living. So basically, we want all our housing areas to have parks available. We want them to be able to walk. Walking is a very good form of exercise, very simple, and it's freely available. So we want them to have more pathways and so on. We want to expand appropriate environments in terms of football fields for children to play, playgrounds, and so on. To increase public motivation and understanding through public education. So we're having more awareness. Similarly, like these webinars are more for medical practitioners. So probably we can even embark in having such for the in a very basic form for lay people to actually understand what we are trying to put forward in terms of their health benefits. And then, of course, to intensify behavior change programs by having what we call as campaigns like Jom Kurus, Jom Exercise. These are all simple terms to actually get fit, get fat to fit, and all these programs that probably you're more aware of as well. And of course, to enhance partnerships and collaborations between all frontiers. That means from government organizations, non-government NGOs, as well as the private sector. Because of course, Neha, as you know, most of the time, finance is the problem. When you want to conduct programs and, it takes a lot of strain economically as well as financially. So a support between these two groups will probably strengthen and probably give it a much more greater trust than that can maintain it in the long run as well. And of course, we have to strengthen evaluation, monitoring and research as well into finding out what works and keep on doing the things that are going on very well and is right for them. So these key 6 thrusts will focus on strategies involving the multi-sectors such as the federal government, corporate business industry, so on, learning institutions, of course, all our universities, transportation to allow people in the rural areas to actually come out to the government side, to the urban areas and so on, health sectors, and of course, the media has a very big role to play in this, in spreading the awareness and information as well. And of course, evidence-based strategies that are outlined to promote physical activity through implementation and monitoring in a more efficient manner with probably the 4 key settings of education, community, workplace, and of course, healthcare. I think this is the way that the programs that we have put in place in the country so far. I think that's a very very good question and a very tough one to answer as well, because everything has been complicated because of the COVID situation. But I'll probably bring into context here that the Ministry of Health has made certain projections on the prevalence of diabetes. And if you look at our National Health and Morbidity Survey that was done in 2011, 2015, and 2019. In 2011, it was found that, I'll go even behind that, maybe 2006, our prevalence of diabetes was about 11.6%. In 2011, it went up to 15.2%. And in 2015, it's about 17.5%. And currently, we are just hovering at just below 20% at 19.7%. So as you can see, in about 10%, it has grown from 2006 until now. And we expect, or the ministry expects, that by 2025, our diabetic prevalence will increase another tenfold to about 31%, which means about 30% of the population is going to be diabetics. This is for adults age 18 and above, which would be an estimated 7 million of our population. And currently now, our population of Malaysia is about 36 million, both undiagnosed and diagnosed as well. So if you look at this, the target that has been set in 2025 is to reduce from our current rate of 19% to about 15%. So if you're talking about that, then of course we have to have lifestyle interventions to be put in place, because this is the basic and should be the base of the pyramid as it tapers upwards. So lifestyle modification in simple terms is of course medical nutrition therapy, or what we aptly say as MNT. It's important in preventing diabetes and managing the existing cases of diabetes and delaying, of course, the complications. So a proper diet education for everyone should be made available either by social media, by availability in the internet, by all medical practitioners having access of a dietitian or a nutritionist to refer to. And the goal, together with medication, is to attain and maintain blood glucose levels. And not only blood glucose, but also blood lipid profile, blood pressure, because they're all interrelated, as we know, part of the metabolic syndrome, as you say. And these goals can also be achieved by healthy living and, of course, by healthy food choices. And this is where we want them to be very strong at the base area. So our recommendation from the ministry as well as all the guidelines as well is that the mainstay in prevention and treatment of diabetes has to be medical nutrition therapy. As for the obese and overweight individuals, a modest weight loss of about 5 to 10% of the initial body weight over a period of about 6 months is a recommended thing to prevent diabetes, type 2 diabetes, of course. So we use that as a goal-setting tool where patients can be educated, try to adhere to a simple, healthy living plan, and aim for a modest weight loss of about 5% and bring it on to 10%, and you should be doing well. A balanced diet, of course, is another important thing which we want to educate, whereby 45 to about 50 to 60% of the diet should compose of carbohydrates. The problem, I think, right now is that a lot of us are consuming way high proportions of carbohydrates in our meals, especially both our countries love rice, and we eat a lot of rice-based products like dosa, idli, and so on. And about 15 to 20% has to come from protein and about 30% from fat. So we have to educate them. A lot of people do not understand what percentage of these macronutrients actually makes sense. To them, they know about carbohydrates, but they do not know how much of it they should be able to take, how much they should restrict in the diet. So this is where education should come in. And of course, another component is glycemic index. So part of the medical nutrition therapy is by introducing this component of glycemic index, which foods have an higher GI and which foods have a lower GI, to make healthy choices to prevent your sugars from spiking up and worsening your diabetes. And another thing, Neha, is about the prevention of diabetes in the form of lifestyle modification, where physical activity, when we tell our patients, please go out and exercise, please go, they do not have that education of being told of what to do. They do not know the difference between aerobic exercise, resistance exercise, which actually is beneficial in what way, and so on. So blanketly, we just educate and tell everyone that you should exercise about 5 times a week, and this should be about modest, about 30 to 150 minutes. Of course, there's a difference in maintaining weight as well as in losing weight, and in terms of actually keeping your body healthy. We know exercise per se does not make you lose weight, but it actually improves your healthy behavior, keeps you adherent to your appetite and your diet and so on. And this is a very good way of, again, being at the base and going upwards and maintaining a very good glycemic index, as well as a lifestyle modification before even the introduction of medications and the other interventions that are existing in terms of diabetic control. Yeah. I think that's a very good question, because we have so many guidelines, Neha, that actually tells you about managing, about starting with metformin, the baseline medication, going on to sulfonylureas and more complicated combination drugs that we have available. But I think in a simple way of putting it, diabetes is a chronic illness that requires continuing medical care. It's not just by diagnosing and giving one medication and expecting that the treatment should be throughout the individual's lifespan. It has to be assessed again, evaluated, intervened, and again, evaluated, intervened, and so on. It keeps on going in a wave, so to speak. And of course, patient self-management education is very, very critical in this disease process, especially this chronic disease. The patient has a major role to play in their treatment. So to prevent complications from occurring and reduce the long-term effects as well. As you can see, that diabetes is a very complex disease that requires many issues beyond just glycemic control, and a large body of evidence exists that we need to use to make these decisions. So of course, a complete medical evaluation is very important, and it should be done to classify the patient. So at which point do we intervene in giving a therapeutic intervention would depend, of course, in the point of time that the patient comes and sees us, the presence or absence of diabetic complications, in their option itself. Because, Neha, there's some patients who probably need to be on insulin, but because their lifestyle, they themselves do not adhere or do not want or do not wish to start on insulin. So we have to take their points of view into account as well before we formulate a treatment plan. So that's what we mean as formulating a management plan with the patient being in the center, holistically having the dietitian, the lifestyle intervention, and so on, and making this affordable for him to continue the care. I think that's a very critical thing, even in countries like India, as well as a developing country like Malaysia. Cost is a very big issue. So we have to make sure that the therapeutic intervention that we consider for our patients is cost effective as well. And if the diagnosis has already been made, the evaluation should be made based on the previous treatments that the patient was on and the present degrees of the glycemic control. And of course, we have to order laboratory tests as well to make sure that we actually know what are the concurrent diseases that the patient is actually suffering from, and not just only the diabetes. So coming to all of this, when do we start? The earliest institution of the treatment of diabetes, once we find that the patient is having an impairment in the glucose control, in terms of HbA1c that is already on an elevating trend, that is already showing some abnormality, and not to a point when it's already substantially elevated, definitely is associated with an improvement in glycemic control over the long term, and of course decreases the long-term complications. So I think the best time to intervene is of course at the right time, which the physician has to at a certain point of the patient's life where the physician has to intervene and see. A lot of factors like family history, genetics, and a lot of things also have to be taken in account as well. So I wouldn't say that there's one particular point that you have to start, but we have to take into all of these factors before making a decision. Now, what factors should we consider before we start the first-line treatment in managing diabetes? Any plan that recognizes diabetes self-management education, the education itself is an integral component in the treatment. So we have to educate. I think that is the first point, that we need to educate the patient itself on what disease he's facing now. And developing the plan, consideration should be given to the patient's age, of course. How old is the patient? If they are young, we should exclude type 1 diabetes and, of course, be more aggressive. School, work, what is the schedule? What are the conditions, the physical activity, the work the patient is doing? And again, we come back to eating pattern, the social situation and personality of the individual as well, the cultural factors. Of course, being rice-eating countries, we tend to have a lot of patients who love rice, and you cannot immediately tell them to stop. It doesn't make sense, and of course they will revolt and rebuke your treatment plan that you're giving. And of course, whether there's already complications of diabetes present, then of course the treatment will go to insulin and so on. So a variety of strategies are available, and techniques should be looked into based on available guidelines to provide adequate education development plan with the patient. And I think we as clinicians should be as problem solvers. We have a lot of problem solving skills that we need to spend. But again, Neha, the problem is we have about 100 patients in the OPD, and we have only that amount of time that we can actually spend to consult with them. So as you can see, it's a very magnanimous problem. But I just hope our colleagues will do their best in this available situation and probably formulate a good treatment option for the patient individually as well as holistically. Yeah. Right. Again, this statistic that you're sharing with me actually is from the National Health and Morbidity Survey, which was just done in 2019. And that paper actually showed that 1 in 2 adults are overweight as well as obese. So the obesity rate is about 30%, and the obesity rate is almost 20%. It's about 19.7%. So if you combine both, it's almost touching 1 in 2, 50%. And of course, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, they're all linked. They're a subset of the same bigger problem. Probably if you're looking at the iceberg, below that, you will definitely find obesity as one of the effects that is actually contributing to the iceberg floating in the sea as well. And of course, recommendations is almost similar to the control of diabetes and the glycemic index and so on. Again, I would like to refer to our National Strategic Plan of Non-Communicable Diseases for 2016 to 2025. Again, a well-planned strategy is in place to try to reduce the obesity rate from being 20% to try to bring it down to at least 15%. But if you're looking at the trajectory that we have been going through for the last 10 to 15 years, I don't see anything miraculous happening in the next 5 years that we are actually going to negate and go negative. In fact, it just looks like it's going upward and going to be positive. But having said that as well, we have to respect interventions that are in place and hope that they will work. One, of course, is the National Salt Reduction Strategy to prevent and control non-communicable diseases. So this is a very simple plan of reducing your daily intake of salt to bring it down so that you bring down your hypertension and of course bring down your obesity and so on. We also have the National Strategic Plan for Active Living, which I mentioned earlier, from that was NASPAL, 2016 to 2025. And of course, we have another program that is called Strengthening the Chronic Disease Management at the Primary Care Level, called the ENPHC initiative. But having said all these initiatives, Neha, I would say that primary thing to reduce your weight has to come from the individual. If you set a goal that you would like to lose weight in 6 months of probably 5 kilos, if you're not going to take a single step a day, then it's just going to be wishful thinking to lose that 5 kilos in 6 months. So more than goals, I think habits also is another very important thing. So we should have this a system where recommendations should be given to employers to allow their staff to probably have an half an hour break throughout the day, probably to do some light exercise at work, give them initiative tax breaks to join gyms, lifestyle changes that we as physicians should speak up more. We should actually tell our patients and give them, instead of just medication and management plan of diet and so on, we should actually give them and probably an exercise schedule or something that fits this one, or have ready-made, get our physiotherapists or our fitness instructors into our management team as well. So in my center, we do have physiotherapists as well as a fitness coach. In fact, my dietitian is a part-time fitness trainer as well. So when you have all this, skill set available, so it is easier for the patients to actually adhere more because they're listening it from all different fronts. So I think that is where we should go. It should not be only at the government level or in the private sector level, but I think it should be everywhere, including media, including of the community as well. And of course, I think the most important area is parents to children, because I think once the parents make it compulsory for the kids, then I think that will, the parents themselves will be accountable to their children, right? So I think that's the way to go. As you know, I'm a bariatric surgeon as well. So certain proportion of my work is related with a lot to obese patients. So that's why I seem to know them very well. And though many people in Malaysia are eligible for bariatric surgery because just on account of their BMI, but the awareness is still very poor. If you look globally in the consensus statements of the number of bariatric surgery cases that are done globally, of course, India is quite high, very much higher than our regional areas as well, but it is still probably less than 1% of the world population. So it's still very, very low. And of course, we in Malaysia would like to have our own bariatric surgery guidelines, which we have already in the midst of developing as well, and it should be launched anytime very soon. At the moment, we are using our Asia Pacific bariatric surgery guidelines. And we also have in the guidelines that I mentioned to you earlier, Neha, which was the Primary and Secondary Prevention of Cardiovascular Diseases 2017. We have a component on bariatric surgery there, which mentions that it's the most significant and sustained form of weight loss treatment. And it's definitely recommended when lifestyle and pharmacological interventions have failed, despite going a program where these patients have already been put in and have been followed up by a multidisciplinary team. And if they have comorbidities and so on, of course, that puts them in a better position to undergo life-saving bariatric surgery. According to the consensus guidelines that we have, for Asians, the appropriate BMI would be 35 kg per meter square and above. But of course, in Malaysia, we are Asians, so we take it at 2.5 BMI less. So for 32.5 BMI with comorbidity, and for 37 BMI without comorbidity, puts you in prime position to proceed with bariatric surgery. But this is just a criteria. After that, you have to go evaluation by the dietitian, the surgeon, the endocrinologist, the physician, the team as well, what we call as a multidisciplinary component analysis. And we perform this to make sure that the selection of the patient, in terms that it's genuine and the patient understands the circumstances, psychological evaluation as well, and then the patient is able to go for bariatric surgery. The other problem is, Neha, that in our country, in Malaysia, bariatric surgery is not covered by insurance. And also it is not provided by the government. So it has to be out of the pocket. So again, only a certain factor, a certain group of the population can afford it. We have something that is called our employee provident fund, where every monthly, every individual actually contributes to the fund. You are allowed to use your account to a certain proportion of that savings to use for life saving surgeries, including bariatric surgery. So that is another avenue that patients are able to use with the guidelines, of course, to pay for this life saving surgery. Yeah. That's an excellent and a very great question. I think it really sums up a lot of what we have discussed earlier. And I totally agree. I think for any country to actually develop, fantastically, is to have a very good health program for their population. And of course, the health awareness has to be very high. That's why we are comparing ourselves to countries like Sweden, the Scandinavian countries, where health education, health literacy, everything is above the 90th centile. So one would wonder why in Malaysia, where we are getting so advanced and so developed, and again our health literacy is so low. Well, Neha, I must share with you that Malaysia does have a very, very good healthcare system, in the sense that almost 70% of the burden of the health situation in Malaysia, the diseases and all, is actually carried by the government hospitals. And how the government hospitals actually provide care, both nursing care, primary care level, as well as tertiary subspecialist levels. Even bariatric surgery is available in the government hospitals as well, but at a very much subsidized rate. So if you're going for a specialist consultation, maybe it will be, if you compare for a non-specialist to a specialist, for a non-specialist probably it's about 5 ringgit, which is about $2 US, and you can get a consultation from a doctor. Whereas if you're going for a specialist, then maybe it's about a little bit more pricier, maybe about $5 to $10 US. So if you look at that, it's very, very affordable, and I think this, in a way, being a good thing, it also is a detrimental fact, because a lot of patients or a lot of people in the population would take this as something that they can actually just take it for granted. So health services are available. It's very affordable for them. So they do not take care of their health. There is no risk for them in terms of getting diseases where you're not given treatment because you don't take care of yourself. We are not so unkind or cruel. No matter what you do, whether you're a smoker, whether you consume 2 big large bottles of Coca-Cola, there is no accountability on the individual. And at the same time, we do not actually go around and telling them, oh, this is wrong, and we're going to put you behind bars and so on. So this is the situation. So if people do not take their own initiative to take care of their health, which is health literacy, then I think it really makes the healthcare overburdened at some point. Because when you are giving treatment and you're giving good accessible healthcare and so on, the individual at the end of the spectrum is not making the initiative to appreciate what is available, as well as taking prevention. I think right now we are going back to preventive medicine rather than therapeutic medicine. Our hospitals are getting smaller. They are becoming more and more subspecialized with super specialty and so on, all over, mushrooming all over the world. And if you have situations like this, then the general consensus to manage the general diseases are going to be affected, because you find that the ones who are interested in managing the primary care level and prevention and all that will be more of the epidemiologists, more of the persons who are into research and so on, rather than the end user. So I think in the end of the day, health literacy is very important, and we in the health industry should actually try to promote awareness to all our population as well. And another important thing that I think to pay for healthcare services, everyone has to play a role. So probably in a national healthcare scheme, insurance, a public insurance, or a public a fund or something that kind of like manages the disproportionateness. Maybe the more affluent, the more richer will probably contribute more, whereas the more poorer will be able to absorb. But they have to give, even a 10 paisa or 20 paisa, I think should be given, because at least they will know how much they are putting into the fund for them to get back the reward rather than getting it for free. I seem to think now that getting things for free is, you know, it's more detrimental in the long run as well. So, I mean, that's of course my point of view. I think everybody is free to entitled to their own opinions as well. But I totally agree that health literacy has to be a very, very achievable thing that we should be all gunning for in future, Neha. Really a pleasure being here, Neha, and thank you for all those wonderful questions. I found the questions are so relevant, very well structured as well, and it really was food for thought actually. and I'm really happy that I was able to help out in disseminating information from our point of view, from our side of the world, and hopefully it will be of benefit to everyone and all your viewers there as well.